Best for our country. We must choose someone to lead us and stand at the head of our national government. The world has been going through the greatest economic crisis in all history. We may be somewhat confused by the discussion of the tariff, reconstruction, farm relief, care of the unemployed, deflation, the gold standard, and many other issues that have come into the campaign. Who is the man we can most safely trust to solve these problems for us? Our situation is too serious for us to consider employing a personal favorite or anyone because he smiles at us and entertains us.
Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Donald March. I'm president of Mamaroneck's Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you all to our October 1992 program. Tonight we have a rather special presentation for you, 1892 to 1992, a century of American presidential elections and the fine art of American political items collecting. Hopefully, in a few moments, you'll be hearing a song that matches what it is that we're trying to do. That song is called Hail to the Chief. It was played first in 1837 at the inauguration of Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren came from New York, and it has slowly evolved into our nation's presidential theme song. The recording that you will hear once that is straightened out in the studio will be the actual recording that was played at the 32nd inaugural on March the 4th, 1925, when a gentleman named Calvin Coolidge was inaugurated as President of the United States. The nature and the pageantry of presidential politics and the 51 campaigns for the White House over the last 204 years has been evolving and amassing a very rich history all its own. Each campaign for the White House since 1788 has been dominated or world leadership. Tonight we stop and tarry with each one repeatedly as we examine the candidates and the campaigns since 1892. To help illustrate the pageantry of presidential politics, we have displayed a wide variety of objects from past presidential elections. To help understand the evolution of the ever-changing campaign process, I would like to now go to a videotape that will be piped in here from the control room. Gloria, whenever you're ready.
Autumn Madness, welcomed at 4-year intervals as grand sport by Americans in every walk of life, has been part of our national landscape for some 200 years. The presidential campaign is the very essence of the American experience, a microcosm of our collective identity. Everything that makes us uniquely American is present within it. The boisterous expression of a free people's will, a reaffirmation of faith in our ability to make things better, our wholehearted participation in a spirited competition. In politics, this competition led to the creation of thousands of items designed to help win the contest. As you view these objects, look for clues about the goals and tastes of their creator. Ask yourself, at whom were they aimed? What images created? What issue addressed? What technology utilized? The Founding Fathers, James Madison, framer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris, who drafted the document, and George Washington, who chaired the convention, scorned political parties and the antagonisms they would certainly arouse. Even such committed Democrats as Thomas Jefferson visualized a country led by gentlemen who advanced their ideas through rational debate. Prior to the 1820s, voting was often restricted to freeholders and taxpayers, but widespread land ownership led to the most democratic electorate in the world. Sadly, many qualified voters were discouraged from participating or voted as directed by the leaders of their communities. In the early 1800s, American-crafted commemorative buttons and fine foreign-made china with political themes were favored in well-established homes. Patriotic prints and other politically inspired luxury items were also imported. The rising influence of the frontier and the advent of the Romantic era, which celebrated nature, instinct, and emotion over intellect and education, encouraged common men to claim their right to vote and led to the lifting of the last limitations on white male suffrage. While elegant items were still made, campaign newspapers, broadsides, and lapel ribbons were designed to be affordable and reach the masses. Political cartoons were simplified for the new, often barely literate voters. Common people proclaimed their political allegiances with drawings of favorite candidates, carvings to promote a political hero, jugs to toast success at the polls, and paintings to advance a cause. Some even transformed prized possessions like flags into campaign banners. The dawning of the age of iron and steel after the middle of the century led to industrialization and growth of cities. Using the model of Civil War armies, city workers and town dwellers were organized into a disciplined electorate. Marching in huge nighttime parades, they carried torches and waved banners under illuminated skies. After the parade, they roasted oxen and celebrated with fellow party members. Often they were entertained by partisan choruses. At home, they played political melodies on their parlor pianos and danced to a partisan quick-step. Presidential elections were fiercely fought and carried by narrow margins. Voters were deeply committed to specific parties. Political affiliations were publicly proclaimed and had a place in everyday life. Political objects were now durable and mass-produced. The sensational press, massive immigration, expanded education, and technological progress changed the political landscape after 1896. As the gap between rich and poor grew, socialism flourished. Meanwhile, commitment to the major parties waned. Candidates took to the rails and conducted whistle-stop campaigns to reach the vastly enlarged electorate. Household items, leaflets, and cheap mass-produced buttons became the most characteristic political objects. Campaigning had become nationally directed, industry-financed, and calculated to reach a large electorate at a low per-unit cost. The giveaway celluloid button replaced purchased lapel pins. As the electorate grew even larger and more independent, campaign objects became progressively plainer and cheaper. Beginning in the 1920s, radio joined the whistle-stop tour as an effective way to reach the far-flung public. Although buttons, clothing, and paper items still play a significant role, since the 1950s, campaigns have been dominated by inanimate artifacts, televised debates, media events, and political commercials.
Ronald Reagan is determined to put killer weapons in space. The Soviets will have to match us, and the arms race will rage out of control. Orbiting, aiming, waiting. With a response time to fire so short, there'll be no time to wake a president. Computers will take control. On November 6th, you can take control. No weapons in space by either side. Draw the line at the heavens with Mondale.
The purpose of all of these is to sell a candidate. In our commercial nation, the presidential campaign has become the quintessence of salesmanship. Its artifacts can be seen as a window into the national soul. It is the compelling personal image that separates winners from also-rans. But the popular concept of the ideal leader has been redrawn by each generation. In the 19th century, and sometimes the 20th, heroism and success on the battlefield was seen as an excellent expression of character and leadership. Presidential hopefuls were often portrayed as military heroes on horseback, brandishing swords. They've also been depicted as honest men of the soil, farmers whose toil on the earth brought special virtue. Starting with Theodore Roosevelt, ranchers have represented the ideals of masculinity, independence, and life in the great outdoors. In the mid-19th century, the family man became a compelling image. By the turn of the century, the candidate was likely to have a hefty, even portly physique. His girth evidence of the material success that spelled trustworthiness to voters. Nowadays, an athletic, trim physique is a must for the candidate trying to win the trust of a fitness-conscious nation. Many political items use visual shorthand, symbols which have evolved and endured over 2 centuries. Some will be immediately recognizable, the Democratic donkey and the Republican elephant. It may surprise you to learn that the Democratic Party symbol was once the rooster, a scrappy, aggressive fellow who appeared regularly into the 20th century. Other symbols are linked to candidates and tell us something about political commitments and personal traits. Abe Lincoln, the rail splitter, suggests hard work, while the log cabin symbolizes humble beginnings. More recently, such diverse symbols as the bull moose, the PT boat, and peanuts have carried messages to the voting public. Look, too, for the anti-symbols, intended to undermine a candidate's image by attacking his policies, honesty, personal habits, and style. While modern advisors caution against negative advertising, the 1988 campaign proved that attacks on foes remain a political staple.
As Governor Michael Dukakis vetoed mandatory sentences for drug dealers, he vetoed the death penalty. His revolving door prison policy gave weekend furloughs to first-degree murderers not eligible for parole. While out, many committed other crimes like kidnapping and rape, and many are still at large. Now Michael Dukakis says he wants to do for America what he's done for Massachusetts. America can't afford that risk.
Verbal shorthand, the slogan, is another campaign staple. Personal attributes and pressing issues are condensed into a few words. Free speech, free soil, free men conveyed Republican anti-slavery sentiment and calls for Western homesteads. Since then, the Union must be preserved. Free silver 16-1. In gold we trust. Fair play and a square deal. A new deal. Peace, prosperity, progress, and many others have enlivened the political landscape. Third parties' active calls for prohibition. Give us to drink the crystal stream, and this shall ever be our theme. Away with wine, away. And votes for women have become part of our political heritage. Such third-party agitation often prompted the major parties to bring these issues into the political mainstream. The race for the presidency begins with primary contests, now spanning nearly a year. But the real presidential campaign starts at the party conventions. For nearly 150 years, conventions have combined a carnival atmosphere with a serious purpose. They nominate candidates, set the party agenda, and energize the faithful. Traditionally, the campaign begins on Labor Day, when the nominees, whether silver-tongued orators or men of few words, hit the campaign trail. In this century, candidates have offered their message in crowded halls and on city streets, at factory gates and state fairs. With banners waving, these events are at the heart of campaigning, American style. But campaigning does not always need large crowds. The baby kissed, the hand shaken, and the personal word are very much a part of a candidate's appeal, as are the personal efforts of followers to rally their fellow voters. Getting the right to vote and getting out the vote have both been essential to the campaign. Blacks and women fought long and hard for the ballot. While it has been progressively more difficult to convince Americans to exercise this privilege, voting is still a treasured right. On Election Day, after a study of the issues and a measured appraisal of the candidates, men and women cast their ballots and play their part in maintaining the world's oldest constitutional republic. The following January, the winner is inaugurated as President of the United States. Our national leader, one of the most powerful men in the world, the newest occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House.
Pro-silver plank. The author of that plank was a 36-year-old agrarian populist from Nebraska. In support of that issue, he ignited the convention, giving the most popular political speech in the nation's history. I'll now play an excerpt of that speech for you.
If the gold standard is a good thing, we ought to stand in favor of its protection and not in favor of abandoning it. And if the gold standard is a bad thing, why should we think that other nations are willing to help us to let go? If they tell us that the gold standard is the standard of civilization, we will try to them that this, the most enlightened of all the nations of the earth, has never declared for a gold standard, and that both the great parties this year are declaring against it. More than that, they will flip the pages of history in vain to find a single instance where the common people of any land have ever declared themselves in favor of the gold standard. They can find where the holders of fixed investments have declared for a gold standard, but not for the masses have. Mr. Carlyle said in 1878 that this was a struggle between the idle holders of idle capital and the struggling masses who produce the wealth and pay the taxes of the country. They tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We will try that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and heal our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city of the country. We care not upon what land the battle is fought. If they say my revolution is good, but that we cannot have it under other nations' effort, we will try that instead of having a gold standard, because England has, we will restore by federalism, and then let England have by federalism, because the United States has. If they dare to come out in the open field and to say the gold standard is a good thing, we will fight them to the uttermost. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interests, the laboring interests, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer the demand for gold standard by saying to them, you shall not set down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. That's what that cartoon is to the left over there. William Jennings Bryan depicted with a cross of gold and a crown of thorns. Bryan had only hoped his speech could get him the vice presidential nomination. He'd only hoped to get the vice presidential nomination, but his silver tongue and bimetal views earned him the presidential nomination itself at the age of 36. Running as both the Democratic Party candidate and the Populist Party candidate, Bryan's campaign broke all traditions. He traversed over 18,000 miles of America by rail, and in so doing ushered in the style of campaigning that we today call whistle-stopping. His bold, innovative style earned him the honor of being the nation's first modern presidential candidate. On the opposite track, McKinley's campaign was professionally managed, which was another political first. Mark Hanna orchestrated the packaging and the selling of the McKinley campaign. He did it so well, it was almost as if he was selling patented medicine. He raised millions of dollars, organized rallies of workers who favored the full dinner pail. used the mail for the first time to send out leaflets to voters' homes, and pressured railroads to give rock-bottom fares to Ohio. Well, why Ohio? Because 750,000 Americans went to Ohio to hear William McKinley speak to them from his front porch. Hanna's professional touch won the day and became a blueprint for the mass marketing of future presidential campaigns. William McKinley would become our 25th president. William Jennings Bryan would run unsuccessfully for the presidency 2 more times. In 1896, you can see the vote in Mamaroneck. William Jennings Bryan and Arthur Sewall, 240 votes. William McKinley and Garrett Hobart, 384. The Democratic Gold Bugs, the Nationalist Democratic Party, had 20 votes. Before departing from the 1896 race for the White House, I must pause to inform you of the significance of yet another first associated with this election campaign. 1896 saw the debut of the celluloid campaign pin. Those involved with American political items collecting will tell you that 1896 ushered in the golden age of the campaign button. 1896 to 1916 is a time in which some of our nation's most glorious and important campaign buttons were made. And tonight, it's my pleasure to be able to display President McKinley and William Jennings Bryan to you from 1896, genuine, authentic. I'll be putting them in this display case later on. I welcome you all to view them. They're the oldest in America, and this one came from the finest collection. It is the finest displayed piece of this type in the United States. This came out of Dr. Morton Rose's collection. This is considered the finest example of this piece. I'll be showing them to you later. Now let's skip to 1900, the year Burton Meegan was born. The campaign in 1900 would be tame after the Big Bang of 1896. I just want to change a few pictures here, Bill, if you could. I'd appreciate it if you put these up for me. And do your best to change them, maybe the cartoons first or second or third. I appreciate that. McKinley would again face off against Bryan, and a young Teddy Roosevelt would be nominated for the vice presidency in the wake of Vice President Hobart's death. For the first time, a woman would attend each party's national convention as a delegate. The Democrats would campaign on anti-themes: anti-gold, anti-trusts, and anti-imperialism. The Republicans symbolized their themes in 4 more years of the full dinner pail and flag-waving patriotism in the aftermath of the victories in the Spanish-American War. And on Election Day, McKinley enjoyed a greater margin of victory than he had in 1896. And in 1900, Mamaroneck cast its votes in this fashion: William McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, 502. William Jennings Bryan and Adlai Stevenson, 239. President McKinley was a politician that loved to sort of shake hands with the voters and people that sort of passed by. He was noted for his red carnation in his lapel pin. And on September the 6th, 1901, he was at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. He was shaking hands for those passers-by I just described. An unemployed factory worker extended his bandaged hand to the president, and as McKinley extended his hand to him in the usual way, he was shot twice from a hidden gun inside those bandages. He died 8 days later, and Teddy Roosevelt assumed the presidency at the age of 43, our youngest chief executive up until that time. Now we get to 1904. The core issue of the 1904 campaign was Teddy Roosevelt's presidency itself. To his opponents, he was a madman, a militarist, hell-bent on imperialist expansion. To his supporters, he was a strong president, able to achieve big-stick diplomacy and gains for the everyday folk with his square-deal, anti-business preaching. The best-known and most beloved symbol to emerge from the Roosevelt 1904 campaign is what you and I all know and love today as the teddy bear. The Democrats were haunted by the ghost of the 2-time loser Bryan. The party had been divided over the gold and the silver issues for years. The party wanted a safe and a sane candidate for the White House. And they wanted somebody to unify behind Roosevelt. They also wanted somebody that didn't have a lot of political baggage. They turned to Roosevelt's home state, New York, and selected as their candidate the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals. Alton Brooks Parker was his name. He's about as close as Mamaroneck has ever gotten to its own hometown boy who ran for the presidency. And I guarantee you most people have not have heard of him. He once lived here and came to own the Parker Farm. Today, his land makes up most of the world-class Winged Foot Golf Club. As his running mate, the Democrats selected 81-year-old millionaire Henry Davis, who was to have bankrolled the campaign. He never did. On November the 8th, voters stood pat with Roosevelt and overwhelmed Parker both nationally and locally. And we'll show you those results from Mamaroneck now. Before departing the local results, here is an example of what is considered one of the best designed classic campaign pins from the 1904 election. And this is rather unique. This is a matched pair. Alton Brooks Parker and Davis in my left, Teddy Roosevelt and Mr. Fairbanks in my right. These I will also be putting on display for you in this display case after this meeting. On the night of his election in 1904, Teddy Roosevelt read a prepared statement that said he would not run again in 1908. Roosevelt's hand-picked successor was Secretary of State Root, who declined. Roosevelt then turned to the Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, who was easily nominated. The Democrats turned one last time to William Jennings Bryan. His issues such as currency reform and trust regulation, once dazzling and radical, now seemed tame. Making up to 30 speeches a day, Bryan could not find an issue to latch onto. In the end, Taft steamrolled into the presidency, defeating Bryan even greater than his defeat in 1900. The most popular political item of this race was the penny postcard. And here are the results from 1908 in Mamaroneck. William Jennings Bryan, 381, and William Howard Taft, 664. Bill, I'm going to ask you to change a few things for me again. These are posted on the sides, but Bill will put these up for you. He's going to show you what the 1912 election was like. This was the most significant election since the 1896 contest. It also began the method we use today to select a nominee of a political party. In 1912, the process was known as the primary and provided for the direct election of delegates to the National Convention in only 12 states. This new process, plus a stiff challenge to President Taft, saw an incumbent president for the first time take off his gloves and campaign for his party's nomination. Taft lost 11 out of the 12 primaries, 2 to Senator La Follette and 11 to Teddy Roosevelt. Once fast and close friends, Teddy Roosevelt and Taft had become bitter political enemies. And those are the two of them scrapping right there. And of course the caption underneath it says, "Auld Lang Syne." The day after losing the Republican nomination, Roosevelt announced the formation of the Progressive Party. A three-way race for the November election was on. On the Democratic side, Governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, secured the nomination after 46 ballots. His vision for the nation was a new freedom, a literal economic program to match Roosevelt's brand of the same medicine which he called the New Nationalism. The contest itself eventually came down to Roosevelt and Wilson. Taft had all but thrown in the towel. Roosevelt was leaving the Hotel Kilpatrick in Milwaukee on October the 14th, 1912. En route to make his speech, Roosevelt was met by a man named John Schrank, who was a saloon keeper. John Schrank poured some cold lead into Teddy Roosevelt's chest. Covered with blood, bleeding profusely, he went to his appointed speech saying these words, I shall deliver this speech or die. It's one or the other. He spoke for 50 minutes and then went to the hospital. Roosevelt, of course, being as strong as a bull moose, he lived. But he did lose the election to Wilson. His third-party showing was the best in the United States' history. The Progressives finished second in a three-way race. Wilson became the only president simultaneously to defeat two other presidents in the same election. And the results in Mamaroneck are as follows. William Jennings Bryan, again, is not there. We're into 1912. Woodrow Wilson, 467. William Howard Taft, 279. And the Bull Mooses and Teddy Roosevelt, a whopping 347. Wow. That's for a third-party candidate. Not bad. 1916. The most famous quotation of this campaign was blurted out by Vice President Thomas Marshall, who said, "What this nation needs is a good 5-cent cigar." Cigar boxes began to carry the portraits of the candidates at that time, and in turn they have themselves become collector's items. However, the item most in vogue was the campaign button. It would be the last hurrah for the golden age of campaign buttons, which began back in 1896. There's also an election in which women could vote in 12 out of 48 states. Both parties stressed advertising techniques and mass marketing appeals that had never been tried before. This included billboards, signs placed in streetcars and trolleys, ads in newspapers, and, believe it or not, the first films produced for the movie audiences in those little 2-minute blurbs that you got when you were at the theater. Wilson, again, the Democratic nominee, was the man of peace, the man of the hour, the man who kept us out of war. His new freedom programs of reduced tariffs, reduced influence of monopolies, a child labor law, a woman's compensation law, a Federal Reserve banking system, an 8-hour day for railroad workers, spelled progress and prosperity to voters. Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican nominee, was stern-faced and had the reputation of an iceberg. He was a very disappointing candidate. His positions often seemed contradictory. Yet, in spite of those contradictory statements, as the war clouds were gathering, Hughes gave the pacifist President Wilson a good run for his money. For almost 2 days, the election outcome was in doubt. The election came down to who would win 13 electoral votes in California. By a margin of less than 4,000 votes, Wilson did. This gave rise to the popular song entitled, "Be Good to California, Mr. Wilson. California's been real good to you." As you can see, in Mamaroneck, they sort of did a little bit of a reversal in 1916. They weren't too thrilled with Woodrow Wilson after 4 years. They voted rather overwhelmingly for Charles Evans Hughes and bucked the national trend that had put Wilson back in the White House. 1920. This election was conducted in a climate weary of war. The public, who had patriotically planted victory gardens and dutifully practiced meatless Tuesdays and wheatless Wednesdays, grew disenchanted. 50,000 Yanks never returned from over there. A post-war economy had soured, and Wilson's new freedom had been transformed into a strange and threatening new world order symbolized by the League of Nations itself. In this isolationist climate, the Democrats met and selected James Cox for president, and the fifth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, ran for vice president. He was Wilson's Secretary of War at the time. Cox and Roosevelt made a fateful blunder on the very first day of the campaign. They stopped in to see the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who had suffered from a stroke. From that day on, they were hopelessly linked to Wilson and his failed presidency by the voters. Their slogan, "Cox Sure," never electrified the electorate. Cox, however, was a diligent campaigner. He traveled 72,000 miles, giving 400 speeches to 2 million people. In the process, he was heckled. People threw tomatoes at him. He was arrested for speeding, and he survived a train wreck. On the other hand, the Republicans would seek a return to the days of the front porch campaigning, which symbolized the good old days of McKinley's tariffs and isolationism. They chose Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding after a deadlocked convention couldn't agree on a candidate. Harding's selection was actually orchestrated by 15 men in, quote, a smoke-filled room. The vice presidential choice was the popular governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, who impressed the nation by firing the entire Boston police force after they went out on an illegal strike. The model for Harding was McKinley, but Harding was unlike McKinley in two important ways. He lacked self-confidence, and he did not have his credibility. During the campaign, Harding was confronted with not one, but two extramarital affairs. He even fathered an illegitimate child. Harding stonewalled and denied the obvious. This denial earned him the nickname Happy Hooligan. No political pundit would dare speculate on the outcome of the 1920 election, given Harding's womanizing and the fact that for the first time in all 48 states, women would be going to the voting booths having won their right to vote. Harding's credibility and his womanizing didn't seem to have too much impact because, as you can see from the 1920 elections, he wins overwhelmingly in Mamaroneck and the nation. It wasn't even close. On August the 2nd, 1923, President Warren G. Harding died in office, just as the clouds of the Teapot Dome scandal were gathering to darken his presidency. Vice President Coolidge, vacationing at his family's farm in Vermont, was sworn in as the president in a simple ceremony by his own father, who was a notary public. Coolidge kept cool under the growing depth and breadth of the Teapot Dome investigation. He had a penchant for principle and helped restore people's faith in a Republican administration. Prosperity did the rest. Coolidge was quietly nominated by the Republicans in 1924. His running mate was Charles Dawes. And your host this evening is very proud to be wearing an original campaign pin that proudly states Coolidge and Dawes. And that won't be in the display case. You'll have to come examine me. The Democrats expected the Teapot Dome scandal to give them the keys to the White House. Instead, their own convention gave voters a reason to vote for Silent Cal himself. The Democratic convention at Madison Square Garden lasted for 2 weeks and set a record for the most hot dogs consumed, the most speeches, the most fistfights, the most demonstrations, and the most ballots ever to nominate a presidential candidate. It took 103 ballots to nominate a dark horse candidate named John W. Davis. He emerged with the prize, but found himself tilting at windmills for the entire campaign. Coolidge's safe and sane and steady posters were everywhere. Ladies used Keep Cool with Coolidge fans in the summer, and Coolidge and Dawes buttons like this one were prominently displayed, and radio was brought the 1924 conventions and the fall campaign right into the living rooms of the voters. No matter what Davis said, Coolidge did not campaign for a single vote. He never answered any allegations. He just sat there and kept his peace. Coolidge went on to victory and achieved the biggest plurality of popular votes in history until that date. You could see it was a runaway in Mamaroneck. People voted with their feet in Mamaroneck, and they stampeded to Calvin Coolidge. And now I'd like to ask Bill to put up this one for me. The 1928 campaign. In the summer of 1927, President Coolidge was vacationing at the summer White House in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Suddenly, on August 2nd, he summoned a group of reporters to come see him. He didn't speak to them. He just simply handed each one of them a piece of paper. Do you know what that piece of paper said? I do not choose to run for president in 1928. Short, simple, to the point. The question asked most frequently up until that time, of 1928, was, who but Hoover? The answer came back, no one. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover was the Republican standard bearer. He faced the popular four-term governor of New York, which Bill is getting ready and has up there, Al Smith, in a nasty campaign. Hoover's trademark was a stiff white collar, and his battle cry was a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Smith's trademark was his brown derby and his odd twang. He frequently would say about the new medium we call radio, he would refer to it as the radio. And his campaign song was simply "From the Sidewalks of New York." Smith had some unpopular political baggage. He was a Catholic, and he was also in favor of repealing prohibition at a time when both positions were not too popular. This campaign was waged largely by radio and whistle-stopping. Smith roused the electorate but failed to convince the electorate that prosperity would continue in Smith's presidency. The good people of Mamaroneck, of course, went to the polls that year as well. And in Mamaroneck in 1928, you can see that Herbert Hoover trounced Al Smith by about 2-1. During the 7 months that followed Hoover's inauguration, the country prospered. It peaked, and eventually the bottom fell out of the stock market. As the number of the unemployed reached 10 million, the Republicans set out to renominate Hoover, fully aware that the Depression had happened on his watch. The Democrats nominated FDR, placing full trust in a vague concept that was called the New Deal. Roosevelt was modern in his approach to campaigning for the White House. He was the first candidate ever to widely use the services of a public relations expert. He also was the first candidate to ever use a professional speechwriter. He was also the first to utilize public opinion polls, and the first to use the mail to truly bombard the voters with campaign material. He sent out 63 million pieces of literature in that campaign. And I can just imagine what the local council people and trustees are thinking about 63 million pieces of literature going into the mail. In the end, Roosevelt successfully painted Hoover as a representative of the four horsemen of the apocalypse: destruction, delay, deceit, and despair. Roosevelt had become the hope of the nation as folks anxiously awaited his inauguration. However, in Mamaroneck, Roosevelt's magic did not work. In the darkest hours of the Great Depression, Mamaroneck did not support FDR. Hoover with 4,990 and Roosevelt and Garner with 3,297. Bill, I'll give you this one. 2 days before the 1936 election, Democratic National Chairman James Farley wrote down his election prediction for an office pool. Landon will carry only Maine and Vermont, he said, 7 electoral votes. Farley was off by only 1. Public opinion polls were used for the first time in depth, and they pointed to a walk for Roosevelt, who had been renominated to the sound of his theme song, which was "Happy Days Are Here Again." The Republicans turned to Al Landon, the budget-balancing governor of Kansas. Landon crisscrossed the United States 4 times, but could not pierce FDR's armor. It was America's nastiest campaign. It also broke the lock the Republican Party had on the black vote since the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. The relief many more blacks were getting from the New Deal programs was just a much more popular drawing card. Most of the nation decided to go forward with Roosevelt in 1936. However, the appeal of Al Landon and his Kansas sunflower was undeniable in Mamaroneck. The Roosevelt Revolution was viewed here in Mamaroneck as a threat to the free enterprise system. The ticket of Landon and Knox knocked out Roosevelt and the raw deal here by almost 2-1. $6,054 votes for Landon, 3,884 votes for Roosevelt and Garner. 1940. Bill has put up Mr. Third Term Candidate cartoon. It's not highly visible. It's a rather small one. But let's get a little look at that later maybe as you walk through. As the heavy-soled boots of the German warlord stepped upon nation upon nation upon nation, the eyes of the world turned to England. In such a world climate, the 1940 campaign essentially was a duel to the finish on the staying out of war in Europe. The first televised political convention was held by the Republicans. They nominated a political novice for president, a Wall Street lawyer named Wendell Willkie. Willkie, who was a darling of the media, painted Roosevelt as a warmonger. The great appeaser, he called him. He spoke of America's poor state of military preparedness. He labeled Roosevelt as the dictator. He also referred to him as the Dr. Jekyll of Hyde Park. As Willkie stepped up his attacks, his campaign was moving ahead in the polls. Roosevelt, who had argued he was too busy to campaign, suddenly came out swinging just 2 weeks before the election was over. His promise was simple. I shall say it again and again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into a foreign war. Roosevelt's magic worked. Voters felt assured he was re-elected to an unprecedented third term. 13 months later, we were at war. The 1940 campaign is remembered for being America's greatest election for a wide variety of campaign paraphernalia. It is also the first campaign where limits were placed on individuals who were contributing to federal candidates underneath the Hatch Act of 1939. In 1940, the electorate in Mamaroneck voted once again overwhelmingly for the Republican Wendell Willkie. 8,735 votes for Mr. Willkie, 2,922 for Franklin Roosevelt. 1944. For most delegates to the 1944 Democratic National Convention, Vice President Henry Wallace was too liberal for their liking. Since Roosevelt's health was in decline, the pressure was on FDR to give Wallace the boot. When a compromise consensus of opinion settled on Senator Harry Truman, the Missouri mule turned down the vice presidency flat. FDR fired off a message to Truman. If you want to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war, that's your responsibility. From thereafter, Truman was to be known as the Second Missouri Compromise. The Republicans nominated the New York governor and former special prosecutor of organized crime, Thomas Dewey. Ohio's governor, John Bricker, was his running mate. By 1944, the tide of the war was turning decisively towards victory. This issue and the New Deal were now pretty much out of range of any viable campaign attacks. Dewey was left to attempt to paint Roosevelt as an old and tired human being. He likened Roosevelt to a horse that's run for 12 years and ought to be sent out to pasture. The Democrats responded by lifting a slogan out of Abraham Lincoln's 1864 presidential campaign: never swap horses in midstream. Without a doubt, the desire to play it safe was the determining factor in the 1944 re-election of FDR to a fourth and unprecedented term. In a year of few campaign buttons or related campaign materials, due to a wartime materials shortages, Mamaroneck cast its votes this way. No surprise, Roosevelt lost again. It's interesting to note, Roosevelt never carried Mamaroneck. Thomas Dewey, 8,239. Franklin Roosevelt, 2,945. April the 21st, 1945. As delegates of 51 nations were about to meet in San Francisco to establish the United Nations, the news reached the world that President Roosevelt had died. Harry Truman became our 33rd president, and within 30 days of his swearing in, Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Soon Japan would be stunned by 2 atomic explosions. A decision made by Truman to use these weapons helped save American lives and end the war in the Pacific as quickly as possible. The fallout to the end of the war was high taxes, inflation, and big government spending. All 3 domestic issues would capture the attention of the electorate as they went to the polls in the off-year elections in 1946. The voters deserted the Democratic Party in droves. The continuing domestic dissatisfaction created a rift within the Democratic Party. Former Vice President Henry Wallace, in an alliance with, of all things, the Communist Party, mounted a third-party challenge to Truman's renomination from the left. Always a proponent of civil rights, Southern Democrats were likewise unhappy with Truman. They mounted a right-wing challenge to him by the states' rights Dixiecrat Party, who had nominated the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond. Almost every poll in the nation showed Truman losing to Republican Tom Dewey by lopsided margins. Truman, with his dander up, refused to believe the newspapers. He refused to believe the pollsters. He referred to them as the expert, quote, straws in the wind. He set out to whistle-stop America. He traveled 31,700 miles, and to a crowd in Lexington, Kentucky, he said, "I am trying to do in politics what Citation has done in the horse races. I propose at the finish line on November the 2nd to come out ahead." As if on cue, Citation, always a slow starter, finished 8 lengths ahead in the Golden Cup race at Belmont the very next day. Truman didn't run against Dewey. The target of his rage, as he would flip his glasses off and point them at the people, was that no account, do nothing 18th Congress. Truman's speeches were often answered by the crowds who would shout back at him, "Give him hell, Harry!" On the other hand, Dewey's campaign sat on its lead, taking the high road, avoiding any hand-to-hand combat with his opponent. By election eve, only one of 15 leading political experts in the United States picked Truman to win. Dewey didn't defeat Truman as the Chicago Tribune's headline would have you believe. Rather, it was the president who was right about the American people. Mamaroneck did not follow the nation in 1948. It voted in favor of Tom Dewey and Earl Warren, who ran for vice president. Dewey and Warren, 8,758. Truman, 2,614. And Henry Wallace, a third-party candidate with the Communist Party, I might add, 388 votes. 1952. The Republican campaign victory formula for 1952 was the following: KIC2. Korea, communism, and corruption. Dwight Eisenhower outmaneuvered Senator Robert Taft to win the New Hampshire primary and capture the Republican nomination. I Like Ike soon turned heads on nylon stockings, bow ties, bubblegum cigars, banners, and buttons. Eisenhower left little to chance campaigning in all 48 states. He was the last true whistle-stopping candidate and the first to pioneer campaigning via paid political advertising on television. Television is also credited with helping to keep Richard Nixon as his running mate in that year. The New York Post broke a story about a secret $18,000 fund late in September 1952. Nixon went on TV giving his now famous checker speech. Successfully, he explained the fund was used to fight communism. Nixon vindicated himself and stayed on the ticket. The rest is history. The 1952 Democratic ticket of Adlai Stevenson and John Sparkman of Alabama never caught fire with the voters. Stevenson's attempt to talk sense to the American people was no match for the modern, well-oiled Eisenhower campaign. After 20 consecutive years of Democratic domination of the White House, and amidst the growing concern over Korea, the 1952 campaign was all but over on October the 24th when Ike uttered these famous words, "I shall go to Korea." In 1952, Mamaroneck followed the nation in electing Eisenhower president. Eisenhower received 10,554 votes, Stevenson 3,617. I think they would call that a landslide. That's because he came to Mamaroneck. Very good. 1956. Eisenhower did keep his 1952 campaign promise and go to Korea. By 1953, the Korean War was over, and Ike took most of the credit. Eisenhower shifted his focus thereafter to getting taxes down and military spending reduced, while not losing touch with his foreign objective of further defrosting the Cold War. Ike's health was a factor in this election after he suffered a heart attack in 1955. However, his simple statement to the American people, "I feel fine," seemed to reassure the electorate. In the Democratic camp, once again, Adlai Stevenson was locked in a bitter head-to-head with Estee Kefauver for the nomination. Kefauver eventually withdrew. Stevenson left his choice of the running mate up to the convention, and the convention overwhelmingly chose Kefauver over a young man that had just ridden onto the political scene, Senator John Kennedy. In the election campaign of 1956, Eisenhower's camp was again more masterful at television than Stevenson's. The 1956 campaign is frequently referred to as the bumper sticker campaign. It was the first time that those items that we call today as bumper stickers, or as swipes as some of us refer to them, were used. Most famous ones in 1956 were "I still like Ike" and "I say Adlai." When voters' preferences were known, they did not believe in Stevenson. Rather, they chose peace, progress, and prosperity. They re-elected Ike in another landslide. Was Mamaroneck any different? Don't bet on it. The Republicans, Eisenhower in that year, you can see I did this chart at 3 in the morning. I left the names off. 11,168 for the Republicans and Eisenhower. The Democrats, who for the first time ran with the Liberal Party in New York, polled 3,671 votes. 1960. When the 1960 campaign got underway, the United States was a nation of 50 rather than 48 states. The Republicans had little trouble nominating Vice President Nixon for president and UN Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge as his running mate. On the Democratic side, Senator John F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey battled it out in the primaries. Kennedy emerged victorious, only to be ambushed at the Democratic National Convention by Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy again emerged victorious and turned to Lyndon Johnson to be his running mate. Throughout the primaries and the general election, Kennedy would be haunted by questions about his religion. By stating flatly his conviction was that the separation between church and state was absolute, Kennedy successfully deflected the issue. In the general election campaign, Nixon would run as the experienced vice president, qualified most to be president, when compared to Kennedy's youth and inexperience. As never before, image and sex appeal would become factors in an election. Televised debates would, for the first time, define differences in a galvanizing fashion, and more people would vote than ever before. 1960 was a nip and tuck election. The deciding factor was a handful of questionable Kennedy votes from Cook County, Illinois. They were just enough to give Illinois to Kennedy in an electoral college victory that helped assure his victory. Kennedy would become our nation's youngest president with the smallest popular vote percentage in history, 49.7% to 49.5% for Nixon. Mamaroneck did not believe in Kennedy's magic or his brand of leadership. They voted for Nixon in 1960. 9,359 for Nixon, Kennedy 5,599. On November 22, 1963, the world stood still as John Kennedy's body was loaded aboard Air Force One. Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office as our new president. Dallas was to be the kickoff point for Kennedy's re-election campaign. It ended instead in assassination and the birth of LBJ's Great Society. 9 months after Dallas, LBJ and Hubert Humphrey would win nomination by acclamation. They would campaign on LBJ's Great Society program and their accomplishments. He played it presidential while reminding voters not to take a chance with a reckless finger on a nuclear trigger. The Republican challenger, Barry Goldwater, the consciousness of conservative Republicans, scared lots of voters with his tough talk and forthright positions. The Broadway hit Hello Dolly was transformed into Hello Lyndon. Slogans like LBJ for the USA and USA likes LBJ seemed to be everywhere. While Goldwaterites loyal to their candidate favored the slogan, "In your heart, you know he's right." With the ouster of Nikita Khrushchev and Red China's first nuclear explosion, just happening before Election Day, voters overwhelmingly chose continuing what they had over change. LBJ won a record-breaking 61% of the popular vote. Landslide Lyndon's coattails reached both houses of Congress, transforming both into a sea of Democrats. The campaign T-shirt had come of age, and Mamaroneck voted Democratic for the first time in a presidential election since 1912. 8,857 for Johnson, 6,047 for Barry Goldwater. In March of 1968, a startled nation heard their president speak these words: "I shall not seek, nor will I accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." His 1964 mandate for unity was in shreds. Race riots and a quagmire called Vietnam caused his approval rating to plummet to just 35%. A man stood up alone to challenge the president on Vietnam, and something happened. That man was Senator Eugene McCarthy. Millions of young people got clean for Gene, ringing doorbells and attempting to change the political process from war to peace. McCarthy proved Johnson was not invincible, and Robert Kennedy, seeing an opportunity, entered the race after Johnson's exit. Vice President Humphrey entered shortly thereafter, and a three-way slugfest ensued. Just as RFK was cresting in the late June primary in California, early June primary rather, an assassin's bullet transformed the American political landscape yet again. RFK was dead, and the Democratic nomination would now go to Vice President Humphrey in Chicago. Inside the convention was a splintered Democratic Party. Outside, droves of hippies demonstrated for peace. Mayor Daley lined the streets with the police. The clash that ensued was the most violent political convention in the nation's history. Hubert Humphrey was nominated the same night. His acceptance speech preached the politics of happiness and joy. The TV footage from outside the convention only contradicted what it is that he was trying to say. As Lyndon Johnson's vice president was more guilty by association to Lyndon, he tried to step aside from Johnson's policies on Vietnam late in the campaign. On the opposite side, Richard Nixon would become the first presidential candidate since William Henry Harrison in 1840 to win election after being defeated for the presidency once before. Nixon's the one was his slogan, and his two outstretched hands waving V's for victory became very symbolic. Nixon's surprise was picking a little-known governor, Spiro Agnew, as his running mate. 1968 was not without a major third-party challenge. Governor George Wallace would appeal to almost 20% of the electorate. As the campaign came down to the last 5 days, LBJ played a political trick or treat on the American people. He stopped the bombing of North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Humphrey's popularity soared, and it became a dog race right up till the last day of the campaign. In 1968, Richard Nixon got 7,732 votes here, Hubert Humphrey 6,632. Nixon won a whisker, with only 1% of the popular vote separating Hay and Humphrey. 1972, too early on in Watergate, too late on Vietnam. George McGovern in 1972 was never able to capitalize on an issue against the Nixon presidency. Instead, Democratic presidential candidate George McGovern proposed a utopian idea of giving every man, woman, and child in the country $1,000. Every taxpayer knew where that money was coming from. Senator Thomas Eagleton had a history of mental problems. He was the vice presidential nominee at that point in time, and he eventually withdrew. McGovern's 1972 campaign came to be known in media circles as the Hard Luck Crusade. George Wallace had the cruelest luck of all in 1972. He was paralyzed for life by an assassin's bullet. Richard Nixon, as other incumbents before him, tried to be presidential, saving his campaign slogan of 4 more years, left it up to others. Re-elect the president, as that sticker says over there, was another popular campaign slogan at that time. Re-elect the president was the other. While McGovern's urged Americans to come home. Nixon's re-election was almost a given, yet the seemingly unnecessary Watergate break-in would doom the Nixon presidency by 1974. But at the time, 75% of the American people thought Watergate was just a political joke. The 49-state landslide and re-election of Richard Nixon reflects this view of the American public in 1972. In 1972, you can see Richard Nixon handily beat George McGovern in Mamaroneck. 1976, our long national nightmare is over, said Gerald Ford. He spoke these words as he took the oath of office for president on August the 9th of that year. He became America's first unelected president. Nixon's pardon of Ford eventually proved his own undoing. Yet Ford went on to win his party's presidential nomination despite a very stiff challenge from Governor of California, Ronald Reagan. Ford tapped Senator Bob Dole as his running mate. The pair earned the nickname of the Mamaroneck twins. The Democrats turned to Governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. He entered 30 primaries and won about half. The peanuts became his symbol. It showed up on buttons, belt buckles, scarves, whistles, and jewelry. After picking Walter Mondale as his running mate, the slogan was, "Vote Grits and Fritz." Ford spoke of feeling good about America and making America proud again. The second, there was two political debates. Ford won the first. Second one was won by Carter, when Ford made an unfortunate blunder when he said no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe existed. In 1976, Mamaroneck voted the following way: 7,521 votes for Ford, 6,570 votes for Jimmy Carter. In 1980, Jimmy Carter was the peanut farmer who became president through pardon and prayer. He would become elected. He was the only elected president since Herbert Hoover to be defeated for election. Carter and Mondale would be renominated after a grueling battle for the nomination. Senator Edward Kennedy would fight him for that nomination, and Carter suffered from a crisis of confidence, which was only enhanced by the bumbled attempts to free American hostages in Iran. Long gas lines, high pump prices, and runaway inflation helped to further tarnish that winning smile. In the other area, Reagan successfully tried to get Gerald Ford to be his running mate. He tapped instead his closest rival in the primaries. When Ford said no, he tapped George Bush. Reagan and Bush campaigned on the platform that big government was the problem, not the solution. Their campaign ads proclaimed, "Let's make America great again." To help counter concerns about Reagan's age, he was 69 at the time, Reagan was portrayed as a viral Westerner, complete with Stetson hat, and which he was prominently displayed on both posters and buttons. Carter's last best hope was to face a face-to-face debate with Reagan. Reagan won that debate in a walk. The most memorable slogan Reagan used in the final days of the campaign was, "The time is now, Reagan." As America turned more conservative, his timing was perfect. Reagan won big in 1980 in the nation and in Mamaroneck. Reagan received 7,090 votes to Carter's 4,753 in Mamaroneck in that year. John Anderson was a third-party candidate. He ran on the Liberal line, 1,384. In March of 30th, 1981, President Reagan escaped an assassination attempt with a bullet lodged in his chest. He lived and successfully shepherded his followers into the shredded his now famous tax-cutting proposals. He shepherded his tax proposals through Congress, is what I'm trying to say. His first term was also highlighted by dismissing 13,000 air traffic controllers, appointing the first woman to the Supreme Court. He invaded Grenada to protect American lives, quote, and restore democracy. And as 1984 edged closer, the economy lunged out of recession without reigniting inflation. Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, had this to say about Reagan in 1984. Quote, "Reagan is the most popular figure in the history of the United States. No candidate we could put up could beat Reagan this year." The Democrats put up Walter Mondale, who selected Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate. The first man and woman ticket stepped out on the campaign trail with only a wing and a prayer. By promising to raise taxes, Mondale earned the nickname the Great Depressor. Tip O'Neill's observation proved correct as Reagan and Bush campaigned on the patriotic, optimistic slogan, "Bringing America Back." Reagan outdid his 1980 electoral victory by winning every state except Minnesota. He received 525 electoral votes. In case you're wondering what percent that is, it's 97.6. The largest ever recorded. In Mamaroneck, in that year, people voted for Ronald Reagan 7,816 to Walter Mondale 6,324. Biff, bang, powie. Bruce Morton used these terms to prepare viewers of his evening news broadcast for the sight of Michael Dukakis riding in an armored tank looking for all the world like Snoopy. Those same three words could have just as easily described the entire 1988 campaign, in which two men, largely undefined to the voters, used rehearsed sound bites and a negative fury to create an image not of themselves, but of their opponent. Voters turned off the campaign ads and tuned out the election. 1988 had the lowest voter turnout since 1924. Yet a choice had to be made. George Bush was the victor. He became the first sitting vice president since Martin Van Buren, whose inaugural Hail to the Chief we did not hear earlier, to be elected president. And in 1988, Mamaroneck voted for a Democrat by a 201 vote difference. They voted for Michael Dukakis, 6,796 to 6,595. Extremely close election in Mamaroneck. You might recall that when I started this program tonight, back in 1892, it's been a long program, Mamaroneck had just 2 election districts. 96 years later, in 1988, we had a large enough population to support 28 election districts in Mamaroneck. The Democratic ticket, as I said, carried it by 201 votes out of 14,000 cast. And it's often been said that a handful of votes do not matter. So before I ask you to exercise your civic responsibility and vote on this machine tonight in our straw poll, let me leave you with this short local history lesson. And it's perhaps the most valuable one I can give you tonight. The year is 1884. The presidential race is between Grover Cleveland and Democrat James G. Blaine. The outcome of this election would not be decided until a swing state called New York could come into the fold and be counted. On election night, Albany reported the vote was so close it had no idea who won. But as New York would go, so would the nation. That election was decided right here in Westchester County. Mamaroneck was one of the unreported districts, I might add. By a total of 1,238 votes, Grover Cleveland was elected president. Westchester put him in the White House. What's to say history can't repeat itself? I invite you to be part of tomorrow's history by voting on November the 3rd, and I invite you to make your choice tonight on our straw vote. Before I do that, though, and before we do that, I'd like to take a moment to ask 2 people to come up. It's my pleasure to present 2 certificates to 2 gentlemen. And I'd like to have Mr. Rodolovic come forward and Mr. Fazzarelli. I want to just say for a minute, Mark is responsible for the idea of cleaning up the Guyon Cemetery. And we often hear how the youth of America does not give a damn about its history. They do. This gentleman and his scout troop is responsible for cleaning up the Guyon Cemetery. And I'd like to present this certificate of appreciation to Mark and one to the troop for their fine civic responsibility and their concern for history in Mamaroneck. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience, and I want to urge you all to vote.